Next in the Climate Change Science and Effects section, welcome Honorable Sherri Goodman. Ms. Goodman is a Senior Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center and Senior Strategist at the Center for Climate and Security. Ms. Goodman will speak to us today about climate and security in the age of global disruption.
Hello, I'm Sherri Goodman, and it's a pleasure to be with you virtually today. I wish I were with you in person. I'm the former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, now affiliated with the Woodrow Wilson International Center and the Center for Climate and Security in Washington, D.C. So today I'm going to tell you the story about climate change and national security in an age of global disruption, which we all live in today. And I'm going to start by sharing some of my own personal journey on this own second slide about the convergence of national security and climate security. And my personal journey to connect it to your geographic location is early in my career, I served on the Senate Armed Services Committee staff as the first female professional staff member. And during that period in the 1980s, we were still operating nuclear reactors to make nuclear materials, including out at Hanford, Washington, and at the Idaho National Engineering Lab in Idaho. These are places I visited many times in the 1980s, first to see how the reactors and the processing facilities were working, and later to see how we were cleaning things up. And that's essentially been my journey in my career as a national security professional who started out in the nuclear weapons field and made the transition, as I sometimes say, from weapons to waste. And if we look at this slide, we can see the convergence of what were seemingly disparate fields of national security and national defense, nuclear deterrence, and environment in its early years, and the increasing convergence over the decades of those both. So the recognition in the 1990s that environmental security is part of national security and what we can do affects our global challenges. And today, most tellingly and most immediately for all of us is the climate challenge. And so that takes me to the next slide on climate and national security, where 13 years ago now in 2007, I organized a group of retired senior military leaders, 3 and 4 stars who'd served around the globe as combatant commanders or chiefs of staff in the Army and the other services, to form a military advisory board to address the national security implications of climate change. Many of them were skeptical when we started. They said, "Sherri, why are you bringing into this? We're war fighters, we're not tree huggers." And I said, well, let's just take a journey together. Let's take an educational journey. And we spent a year learning from the world's leading climate scientists, both in the US and in England at the time. And we produced a report, what became a landmark study, which was released in 2007, on the national security implications of climate change as a threat multiplier. That phrase has stuck. We created that. I coined that phrase in 2007. It's now been widely used by many. And our military advisory board has produced numerous studies and led to a whole field of climate and security. So what are the threat multipliers? On the next slide, you can see that they are, of course, heat, the rising temperatures that we face around the planet, drought, extended drought in many places that is changing agricultural cycles, leading to water stress and water insecurity. I don't need to tell you in the Northwest about the fires. You experience that almost every day, but it's become an increasingly regular climate calamity, if you will. Sea level rise, sometimes in your region, compared with ocean acidification, affecting our ocean health and affecting our coastlines, particularly along the eastern seaboard and the Gulf Coast. Flooding in many, many places, particularly in the Midwest, and then extreme storms, storms of greater intensity. Those are some of the direct effects. Just to give you on the next slide, wildfires are raging throughout your region and they have had dramatic impacts on health and human welfare. And we can't forget next disease, which is we're living in a time of a pandemic, and the threat multiplier of disease, which we saw even before the current pandemic. We saw that increased temperatures throughout the planet were moving various disease vectors into regions that they had not been experienced before. And from a military perspective, for example, when I served 8 years as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, the Armed Forces Pest Management Board reported to me. Now, they're a group of epidemiologists, uniformed epidemiologists, medical officials who are responsible to ensure that when our troops deploy, they are protected against disease vectors that they could encounter, from malaria to schistosomiasis. And now we find that that job is becoming increasingly more challenging. COVID, of course, is the ultimate threat multiplier. So what does that mean in terms of disaster costs and risk? Well, you can see on the next slide the increasing disaster cost that's affected us all across the nation. Increased rise in storms, floods, fires, that's affected all parts of our nation. Now, that's just what affects us here in the US, but if they then look internationally, disaster risks are rising because vulnerable populations around the world are increasingly exposed to hazards and are unlikely to be resilient in many of the low-income countries around Asia and parts of Africa. And let's not forget fisheries and health. I think this is going to become increasingly important in future years as we find our oceans are being vastly overfished, and then the stock of remaining fish will not provide the same level of nutrients that we've had before. So where does that leave us? Global peace and national security are affected by climate change in all of the ways you see on this slide, the environmental impacts and the social impacts. Why don't we take a little trip around the world now, at least a few parts of it. I'll be happy to take more in the Q&A and look at how climate change is affecting us in regions around the world and how we think about that from a national security perspective. So let's start with the Arctic. And just to connect it there with your own region, you know, we have our icebreakers are at the shipyard there at the port there in Seattle. So they're quite far away from our American Arctic, but they have the mission of having to go up to the Arctic and down to the Antarctica. And now we find we are in an era where we need more surface level capability. The Arctic is no longer, as we say, only about cooperation. We see Russia seeking to expand transit across the Northern Sea Route. And it's part of the Arctic, the long Northern Sea Route, and to create a toll road for shipping from Asia to ports in Europe. We see China declaring itself a near Arctic stakeholder and seeking to build a polar Silk Road, first utilizing Russia's Northern Sea Route, but ultimately, eventually, a transpolar route over the central Arctic Ocean, which you can see on this slide here with the map, where today we have a moratorium on fishing in the central Arctic Ocean, but it gives all of the signatories, the US, China, Russia, and many others, the opportunity to do research and observe what's happening up there. So, and it's quite likely that in future decades, there will be a viable fishery in and around these regions that these countries will want to exploit. So we have only 2 icebreakers left in our fleet right now. One had a fire, the USS Healy, aboard earlier this summer and had to cancel part of its mission. So we have somewhat of an icebreaker gap today. We are trying to rebuild that icebreaker capability and other capability we need to operate in the Arctic. It's not only about icebreakers, it's also about communications. We need to get better connectivity up in the high Arctic, where we haven't had it. We need infrastructure. We don't have a deep water port. That's why our icebreakers are in Seattle right now. Sometimes people say, well, what keeps you up at night, Sherri, about concerns as we see increased potential competition for geostrategic competition in the Arctic occurring? because of climate change? Well, I'll tell you what sometimes worries me is the potential for an accident. We know that Russia is building up its nuclear capabilities in the Arctic. It has over 40 icebreakers. About more than 10 of them are nuclear powered. It has a floating nuclear power plant. We also know that Russia doesn't have the best nuclear safety record. If you think back to Chernobyl or the sinking of the Kursk submarine, in which many sailors' lives were lost, and there have been incidents in recent years as well. I worry that sometime in the coming decades, we'll find a Russian nuclear-powered vessel running into trouble, maybe with a tanker that it's escorting. And we did a little scenario exercise, what we call a war game, last year with the National Academy of Sciences and with Sandia National Laboratories, looking at what would happen if a Russian nuclear-powered icebreaker collided with its Chinese LNG vessel, escorted vessel, in the Bering Strait in 2050. And what would be the consequences? How would we communicate? How would we rescue people? What do we need to understand today about how ocean currents and ocean circulation is changing in that region? So these are the ways that national security professionals try to think through what might happen in the future and how do we prepare for it. That's one such scenario. All right, let's move around the world a little bit. Here in the Middle East and North Africa, it's all about the water and lack of it. It's already a very dry region. Water vulnerabilities multiply existing threats in many, many ways. We know now that the prolonged drought that occurred in Syria prior to the onset of the world's most deadly conflict was in fact exacerbated by the fact of the prolonged drought that sent farmers and herders who had lived peaceably in rural areas, farming and tending to their cattle, sent them towards the urban regions when water dried up. And that led to civil unrest in the urban areas. There weren't enough jobs, weren't enough ways for people to live. And that led in part, along with political instability, to the deadliest conflict of the modern era. And if we see now, just take one little zoom in here in Iraq, we see that there's not enough fresh water and we have saltwater intrusion into many of the major water sources. This is occurring throughout the world, many coastal areas. Egypt, for example, also very vulnerable to saltwater intrusion in its Mediterranean areas, where it's also been highly dependent on water and agricultural resources from the Nile, which Ethiopia is creating a grand Renaissance dam. So there are many, many challenges in water basins around the world. Okay, let's talk a little bit about now how this affects our national security and our military forces at home, what kind of foresight we have, and our responsibility to prepare. Well, if we go back in history and think of D-Day in 1944, and it's just an example that weather has always been fundamental to our military operations. We planned that D-Day operation was very much dependent on when conditions, air and sea and weather conditions, would be right for such an invasion. So now we live in a world where the weather is no longer stable and stationary. It's harder to predict what it will be next week and what the intensity of that storm will be, or the intensity of the heat wave. So that's why forecasting it becomes so important. And that's where the technology opportunities are going to lie. Now look at how we train like we fight. So we train under the conditions we want to deploy our troops to. And now as the Middle East, parts of Asia, even parts of our own Southwest experience extreme heat days. We call those black flag days, when our troops can't safely train beyond a certain limited period of time when temperatures and humidity are above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're seeing increasing number of black flag days, and it's increasingly affecting the health of our forces. We also have military bases at risk. This is just a snapshot of those in your region. There are many military bases, many subject to flooding, some subject to flooding and drought, and many also subject to the wildfires. And you can see Washington State here, the flood risk throughout the region. Now, if we go to hurricanes, which have devastated a number of our major Air Force bases in the recent years, Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida and Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune in North Carolina both suffered devastating damages in hurricanes in recent years in the billions of dollars, as well as flooding that occurred at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. Those are just three most vivid and maybe expensive examples of the way in which climate change is affecting and extreme weather events are affecting our military bases and our communities and families that live there. Okay, what can we do about it? What's this, we've got this unprecedented risk with COVID and climate, but we also have unprecedented foresight. We have ability to look and better predict the future. So the military, as well as many civilian communities, perhaps like your own, are involved in trying to climate-proof our future, what I would say. For example, in improving the predictive capabilities, deploying renewable energy technologies. We even have put solar panels and renewables with our forces at the front, in part to reduce long logistics lines we had when we were convoying fuel in Iraq and Afghanistan. We found that was putting soldiers' lives at risk because most of those truck convoys were for fuel and logistics. So we're trying to lighten our logistics tail. And the way we do that is in part with better batteries, different types of fuel, and microgrids that enable us to power our forces differently. As we've become more technologically adept, we've also found that in the first generation, we loaded up soldiers with electronics and batteries. Their kit got so heavy they could barely move. So now we've got to lighten their load in many, many ways. We also have things like sail drone, this orange-powered sail drone that's good for ocean mapping. And we know less about the ocean than we know about outer space. So there's a lot more we need to learn about ocean conditions and ocean parameters better to be able to operate them and understand our future. We then get into looking at a climate security plan for the future, which my current organization, the Center for Climate and Security, developed over the last year. And the particular elements of it that are important go to being able to prepare to integrate climate security into our national security planning documents at the highest level. We've started some of that work, but there's a lot more work that we need to do. We need to upgrade our infrastructure and climate-proof our infrastructure. We need to work with our allies and partners, and we need to lighten our logistics load. We also have done a security threat assessment of climate change, something we released in February 2020, where we looked at global climate change and its impact under different scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions. Many of you are climate professionals. You follow the different scenarios, 2 and 4 degree scenarios. On the next two slides, you can see the extent of threat assessment, threat profile affecting various regions of the world under the 2 and 4 degree warming scenarios. I would invite you at your leisure to look at that perhaps a little more closely and to look at our particular recommendations in that report as well. Finally, I want to close on looking at the International Military Council on Climate and Security, something we formed about a year ago that I co-lead with the former Dutch Chief of Defense, where we've brought together over 30 militaries from around the world and national security organizations to look at climate security impacts across military organizations. This is an important sort of leadership opportunity to bring the militaries, who are often major energy users in their country. The US military, for example, is the largest federal energy user and uses about 1% of total energy. So in the US, so as we lighten our load, we reduce our carbon footprint, as we say. And there you can see some of the global climate impacts we identified in that report. And what we say is that climate change threatens the backbone of America's global power. That's a piece I wrote with the former Army Chief of Staff, General Gordon Sullivan, who chaired our first military advisory board. And then, armies can fight wildfires, but they can also do much more about climate change, and that's about getting our own house in order and modeling it for the rest of America. And just this week, this recent week, I issued another piece about climate as a national security threat. We already see its effects, as I've just gone through with you today. And finally, let me end with another piece. I invite you to look at all of these at your leisure on looking at a natural security strategy. And I think you who are watching here, either because you're climate professionals or you're from the region, are very well poised to sort of think about how to turn these ideas into action. A natural security strategy would elevate elements of nature in our own national security leadership. And part of that is climate change, which is what we've been talking about mostly today. But there are a few other elements in it as well, which goes to global biodiversity, which is being lost at an increasingly rapid rate and something we need to be mindful of in our total planning efforts in order not to lose more biodiversity and not to send more zoonotic diseases, such as what created COVID-19 and the coronavirus, across affecting the health of our entire planet. And then there's ocean health, and you all know that, I would assume pretty well. That could be a whole nother briefing in itself. I'll leave you with this. We need to get our house in order. We need to move to to net zero emissions. We can build back our societies better as we integrate the threat multiplier recognition of climate change into our national security. I want to thank you all for joining me today. I hope you have found this discussion informative on the national security implications of climate change and its threat multiplier impact on all of us.
Thank you, Ms. Goodman. We're taking virtual questions in the chat area and on our LinkedIn event page posted in the comments section. Visit the page later to view answers, ask additional questions, and join in the discussion.